You know, my mentor, who was an expert on theology of Jonathan Edwards, once wrote a little book called Justifying a Scare Theology. Because, of course, if anybody was the master of scaring people with their theology, it was Jonathan Edwards. Edwards' sermons on hell would curl your hair. And when he gave his famous sermon, Sinners on the Hands of an Angry God, people actually passed out in the church while they were listening to this terrifying description of God's judgment. Well, let me answer this a couple of ways. First of all, from a biblical perspective, the warnings that accompany the preaching of Christ and the apostles often stir up fear because they are warned about the last judgment and God's wrath that will definitely be poured out. When Paul says that in our sin we are piling up wrath against the day of wrath, that is not a comforting thought. But what we had in the 18th century in America was what we had the idea that man is very bad and God is very mad. In the 19th century, it was man's not so bad and God's not so mad. And now people kind of look down upon hellfire and brimstone preaching. But I preached a couple of weeks ago here at St. Andrews, and I was talking about one of the passages where Jesus was warning about the last judgment. And it was a terrifying text, one of what we call the hard sayings of Jesus. And I mentioned in that sermon, in my whole life, I've only had two people tell me that the reason they were motivated to listen to the gospel and come to Christ is because they were terrified of going to hell. And after the service hadn't ended, 5 minutes later, somebody came up to me and said, "I'm number 3. And then 5 minutes later, another person came up to me and said, "I'm number 3. I said, "No, you're number 4. I just had number 3 a couple of minutes ago." And again, since this is the way Jesus preached, this is the way the apostles preached, this is the way the great preachers of all time preached, by trying to awaken people to the clear and present danger of the state of their soul if they remain impenitent. So my answer to your question is, yes, I think it is justifiable, and it's important to include that element in the full measure of evangelism that we're doing. If we don't warn people of where they're headed, then we don't really care for them. When I was in college and studying the Puritans, I had a professor who said that Jonathan Edwards had to be a sadist because he had this sadistic enjoyment, it seemed, of warning people about hell. And I said to that professor, I said, it seems to me if he were sadistic, it would be that he didn't believe in hell, and if he did believe in hell, there's no doubt he did, the sadist would say to people, there is no hell, and then giggle on their way home for having fooled them into plunging headfirst into that eternal damnation.